The chandelier glowed overhead, spilling golden light across polished marble floors that looked as though they had never been touched by a single speck of dust. The penthouse stretched wide and tall, every corner whispering of money, privilege, and excess. Waiters in pressed black uniforms moved like shadows with trays of champagne and caviar, their steps careful, their faces expressionless. Guests in gowns stitched with gemstones and suits tailored to perfection floated from one circle of laughter to another, their polished voices rising above the swell of a live string quartet in the corner. Every inch of the place seemed designed to remind anyone who entered that wealth lived here and bowed to no one. In the center of it all stood Richard Haworth. He was a man born into money, and then doubled it with ruthless deals in oil and steel. His presence dominated the room, not just because of his height or the expensive cut of his suit, but because he carried himself as though he owned not only the penthouse but the very air people breathed inside it. Every smile he flashed was calculated, every laugh carried an edge of superiority, and every word that left his lips reminded others he considered himself above them. Those who gathered around him did not mind, they sought his approval, his investments, or simply his influence. And Richard thrived on it. Not far from him moved Clara, the black maid who had worked in his household for years. She wore the uniform Richard insisted his staff keep immaculate, crisp white blouse, pressed black skirt, apron neatly tied, and her hair pulled back so tight it left no strands out of place. She balanced a silver tray in her hands, offering flutes of champagne with a smile that was polite but reserved, a mask she had learned to wear after years of quiet service. Guests rarely looked her in the eyes, as though acknowledging her presence would break some unspoken rule. To them, she was background, a moving piece of furniture designed to keep their glasses full. Richard, however, noticed her often, not because he valued her, but because she served as a convenient prop in his endless displays of arrogance. To him, her silence was amusing, her composure something to test. Tonight, as laughter rang out around him, he caught sight of Clara's figure at the edge of the room. The smirk forming on his lips signaled trouble before he even opened his mouth. "You see, gentlemen," Richard began, raising his glass so the light caught it like a jewel, "wealth does not merely separate us from the common man. No, it is education, refinement, culture." His voice boomed, demanding attention, and as expected, the guests around him turned, eager for the next performance. He let the pause linger, savoring the way every pair of eyes hung on him. It is the ability to appreciate the finer things, to understand languages, philosophies, art that the ordinary working folk cannot even begin to fathom. A ripple of laughter spread, shallow but obedient, as people nodded to show they were following his train of thought. Richard's gaze slid deliberately toward Clara, who was offering a glass of champagne to a woman in emerald silk. "Tell me, dear," he called, his tone dripping with false warmth, "do you know any foreign language?" Clara froze for just a second before she bowed her head slightly and turned as though she hadn't heard. But Richard was not about to let her slip away. "Come here," he said, sharper this time, and the room hushed a little at the command in his voice. The guests leaned in, their curiosity piqued. A maid called out in front of everyone. It was a novelty they didn't often witness. Clara stepped closer, the tray balanced perfectly in her steady hands. Richard's smile spread wide, almost wolfish. "Let's make this fun, shall we? If you can translate what I say, I'll give you my entire yearly salary. Imagine that, gentlemen," he chuckled, turning to his audience. "A fortune exchanged over a game." The laughter that followed was not kind. It was sharp, mocking, filled with the thrill of superiority. Clara's hands tightened around the tray, though her face remained calm, unreadable. Her eyes did not meet Richard's, but her silence seemed to fuel his amusement. "Here it is, then," Richard announced grandly, puffing up his chest like a king declaring a decree. He rattled off a phrase in flawless French, rolling the words on his tongue as though he were savoring the taste of them. The guests nodded in appreciation, murmuring about how cultured their host sounded. Clara stood still, her dark eyes lowered, the tray anchored in her hands. The room expected her to falter, to mumble something incomprehensible, to perhaps blush and retreat. They were already prepared to laugh, already leaning forward to see the humiliation play out. Richard chuckled and lifted his glass again. Well, my dear? Care to try? Or shall we assume, as I suspected, that this is far beyond your reach? The silence stretched long, filled only by the faint hum of the quartet in the corner. Clara's chest rose and fell with a slow breath, her fingers gripping the tray just tightly enough to keep her nerves from showing. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak. Every head turned toward her, eager for the spectacle. And in that moment, before a single word left her mouth, Richard's smirk deepened, certain of victory. The scene held like a photograph, tension suspended in the golden air. Would she attempt an answer? Would she crumble? Or was there something waiting that none of them expected? The tray trembled, but her eyes lifted, meeting Richard's for the first time. And in that silent exchange, something shifted in the air, a promise that the night would not end the way he thought it would. The tray felt heavier than it should as the room leaned toward her, but her voice came out steady, clear, and low enough to make people lean even closer to hear. You asked if I know any foreign language? She said, not blinking. You asked the wrong question? A ripple of laughter tried to start, and then died when she continued, not in the language of the room, but in the language he had chosen to show off. The consonants softened, the vowels warmed. The words she spoke in that elegant tongue were not only accurate but living, the meaning shaped by tone and breath. She rendered his phrase flawlessly, then expanded it with a few calm sentences, lifting the idea he had clumsily thrown into the air and setting it down with grace. Glasses hovered between lips and tables. The quartet in the corner slowed, then stopped entirely. He blinked once. Cute, he said, his smile tight. Memorized. She did not look away. She repeated the sentence back to him in the same language, then in another, one with quick, rolling music and bright, clicking syllables, then in a clipped, precise cadence that made breath itself sound measured. A few guests gasped. One man murmured, That's not memorized. And someone else whispered. She switched scripts in her head. He set his glass down, the crystal kiss on marble louder than it needed to be. Anyone can learn a party trick, he said. Wealth buys access to real culture, lessons, tutors. You parrot what you hear. It's admirable for your circumstances. He let the last word hang, heavy and shaped like a collar. A woman in emerald silk, the same one who had taken a champagne from the tray, tilted her head. That wasn't parroting, she said. She changed register. She adjusted tense. She looked at the tray and then at the host. You heard that. He ignored the comment and held out a hand. Give me the tray, he said, like a father asking a child to hand over scissors. She placed it on a side table instead and folded her hands before her apron. He leaned in, the smile returning because the crowd needed him to be charming again. We'll make it fairer. A proper test. Translate something you've never heard. She nodded once, and the nod was not timid. Of course. And, he added loud enough for the room to hear, if you fail even once, you're finished here. No severance, no reference letter. Do you agree? The room hissed under its breath, a half-dozen people shifting, a dozen more lifting phones in that casual way people do when they think history might be about to happen to someone else. Her eyes didn't flinch. You already set the terms, she said softly. But I agree. Keep it fair. He smiled. Oh, I will. He took out his phone and tapped quickly, then lifted his chin to a tall man by the bar. Elliot, say something complex. The tall man cleared his throat and rattled off a paragraph in a language that slid like water over stones, the tones rising and falling with peril. He spoke fast on purpose. He stumbled, just a little, and kept going. It was meant to be a wall. She let him finish. Then she took a breath and translated in simple, exact words, shaping the tones into meaning without imitation, rendering idioms into sense rather than sound. At one point she paused, frowned slightly, and said, He used a northern word there where a southern one would fit. I think he meant this. She gave both options. The tall man's face reddened and then, reluctantly, he nodded. Someone laughed. Not the friendly kind. The host's smile sharpened. Beginner's luck. Again. He turned to a woman with silver hair and pearls like frozen drops. Natalia? The woman obliged with a crisp, hard-edged paragraph, a case study tone buried inside those consonants. There was a legal phrase tucked in the middle like a thorn. The maid listened, head slightly tilted, and then nodded it in the same order, pausing only to explain that the legal phrase carried two meanings, one literal, one customary, and which one applied here. The silver-haired woman's gaze slid toward the host, curious and cool. She's right, she said. He tried again, faster this time, pulling from a language that clicked and hummed, that wore history in its rhythm. She smiled at the first sentence, and answered in that same tongue, exchanging greeting for greeting as if she were stepping onto the floor of a remembered home. She finished and then added, in the language of his bet, "Your pronunciation changed a blessing into a curse. I fixed it." Someone coughed to hide a laugh. Someone else didn't bother. He lifted his voice before any smile could settle. "Fine," he said, dragging the word across his teeth. "You can repeat what clever people say. Let's see if you can handle what matters." He gestured for a server, snapped his fingers, and took a small printed card from a silver tray. "Translate this, exactly." He read a short poem from a donor's card, an artful thing with delicate turns and a metaphor that frayed at the edges if pulled too hard. She let the metaphor sit whole. She walked it across into another language and then back, keeping the image intact and alive. When she returned to the room's tongue, she added one thing. "The last line isn't a promise. It's a warning. It loses that if you make it soft." The poet's name on the card meant nothing to most guests, everything to two. Both nodded. His jaw tugged. A vein near his temple flickered. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," she answered. "I'm working." There was a small, precise silence. You could hear the shape of it. He held it a second too long, and then weaponized it. "I said a year's salary," he called, turning to the room. "And I'm a man of my word." He held up a finger for the laugh that usually followed, but it didn't come. He faltered and then recovered by sharpening the knife. "After one last test. Live. No room for trickery." She didn't move. "You keep adding last tests. And you keep passing them," he said brightly, the brightness brittle. "This will be the last." He dialed a contact and hit speaker. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "My partner in Shanghai," he told the room. "He doesn't speak a word of this language." There was an edge of triumph on his tongue. "He'll speak to you." You reply. "If he says you got it wrong." "If he says I got it wrong," she finished for him. "You fire me tonight." She looked down at the phone like it was a kettle about to sing. "And if he says I got it right?" He glanced around, measured the eyes, and smiled with his teeth. "Then I make a transfer instruction before dessert." The call clicked. A man's voice poured into the room, brisk, businesslike, threaded with jet lag and power. He greeted the host first, and then waited. The host gave a few smooth words, a joke, and then said, "One moment, speak freely." He handed the phone across as if it cost him nothing to do so. She didn't touch it. She left it on the table, hands folded, and listened. The man began to speak. He didn't keep it simple. He threw numbers, a shipment delay, a regulatory phrase that had recently changed, a proverb folded into a business warning, and at the end, he said something like a challenge, a quick turn meant for insiders only. She answered without moving the phone, just loud enough for the mic. She didn't mimic. She translated sense into sense, numbers into consequences, proverb into choice. At the end she offered 2 readings of the last line, one literal, one lived, and explained which one would save them a fine next quarter. The message on the phone still glowed, urgent and undeniable, the words casting a silent judgment across the faces watching. He tried to cover it with his hand, but too many eyes had already seen. Murmurs spread like cracks in ice, small at first, then widening into full whispers. Clara stood still, her hands resting lightly on the tray, her breathing measured, while Richard Halworth, master of the penthouse, master of so many boardrooms, looked suddenly small in his own empire. He cleared his throat, loud and sharp, as though the sound could shatter the whispers. A coincidence, he said, forcing a laugh. Foreigners flatter easily when they see wealth. That's all this is. His voice wavered just enough that the lie sounded thinner than glass. But the guests were no longer eager to laugh with him. They had watched, step by step, as every attempt to humiliate her had turned back on him. They had heard the precision of her words, seen her command of languages he himself barely fumbled through for show, and now they had witnessed an outside voice, a partner of standing and credibility, confirm her worth. Clara lifted her eyes at last. You said one final test, she said, her tone steady, almost soft, but it cut more deeply than a shout. And now you have your answer. It wasn't my trick, or a guest's indulgence. It was truth. I gave it, and he recognized it. Are you still going to pretend otherwise? His jaw tightened, and his hands flexed uselessly at his sides. He could feel the crowd's attention weighing on him. He could not dismiss her without dismissing their own ears, their own eyes, their own judgment. Yet his pride fought like a caged animal inside him. To admit she had won was to admit his arrogance, to step down from the pedestal he had built his life upon. You think you're clever, he spat finally, quieter now, as though hoping the room might not hear. But clever doesn't pay bills. Clever doesn't change who you are. Clara tilted her head just slightly. And who am I? He sneered. A maid. That's all. My housemaid. You'll never be more than that. The words struck like stones dropped in water, the ripples spreading outward to every ear in the hall. Gasps followed, sharp breaths drawn in unison. Several guests exchanged glances, their expressions curdling into something darker, shame, disgust, even anger, not at Clara, but at him. One of the older women in pearls raised her chin. Richard, you forget yourself. That woman just saved your business partner from a mistake that could cost millions. And you call her just a maid? Her voice was cutting, her social weight heavier than her frail frame suggested. The banker with the thick throat followed, his voice measured and deliberate. Contracts matter, Howarth. You promised. Everyone here heard it. A man who breaks his word at a party breaks it in business too. That's what people will say. Richard paled. His empire had always rested not only on money but on reputation, on being the man who delivered, who kept promises, however ruthless. To falter here, before witnesses of this stature, was to invite whispers into boardrooms, into stock exchanges, into deals that lived or died on trust. Clara, still poised, spoke again. You said it was your salary. You made it sound like a joke, as though I could never touch it. But now, it isn't about the money. It's about whether your word is anything at all. Silence followed, heavy and thick, pressing down until it nearly suffocated him. He could not bear it. He turned away, pacing 2 steps, then back again, his hands twitching as though they wanted to seize something, anything, to hold power again. Finally, he turned to her, his voice sharp as glass. Fine. You want to know what happens when you challenge me? You'll get your money, but you'll never work in this city again. No one will hire you. You'll live off your year's salary until it's gone, and then you'll crawl back where you came from. The cruelty in his words was raw, bitter. Some guests looked away, unable to stomach it. Others fixed him with cold stares. Clara, however, did not flinch. Instead, she stepped forward just slightly, enough that the light caught her face, enough that her presence filled the center of the room as though she belonged there all along. You think power is about shutting doors, she said quietly. But power is about opening them. You see me as a servant, but knowledge is its own kind of wealth. You can try to silence me, but you can't unteach what I know. You can't erase what they've all seen. She swept her gaze across the room, and dozens of eyes lowered in respect. You can't take back the truth. Her words landed like thunder muffled under velvet. A guest near the back began clapping slowly, deliberately. Another joined. Then another. Soon the room filled with applause, rising in waves, not for him but for her. The sound swelled until it drowned the hum of his fury, the clinking of his crystal, the pounding of his heart. Richard stood frozen, forced to endure the humiliation he had orchestrated for her. The applause turned into cheers, voices calling her name, voices praising her skill, her dignity, her courage. She did not bow, did not beam with pride, but stood tall and calm, the very picture of grace under fire. He tried one last time to sneer, to wave it all away. "Parlor tricks," he muttered again, but the words fell flat, empty. No one laughed. No one nodded. His power to command their agreement had evaporated like smoke. Then, almost cruelly, his phone buzzed again. Another message, the preview glowing on the screen where the nearest guests could see. This one read, *confirmed transfer of 7 figures saved by correction. Immediate acknowledgement required. Who was the staff who intervened? The crowd rustled. Richard snatched the phone up, but the damage was done. They had seen enough to know. His empire might not crumble tonight, but a seed had been planted, doubt, suspicion, the whisper that Richard Haworth was not invincible. Clara turned to leave, lifting the tray from the side table with the same composure she had carried all evening. Before she moved, she looked at him one last time. "The difference between us isn't wealth," she said. "It's that I don't need to lie to be respected." The words landed harder than any translation, any clever retort. They were the pure, unadorned truth, and it seared him like flame. As she walked away, the applause followed her, echoing through the marble halls, while Richard stood in the center of his own gathering, drowning in the silence of those who had once worshipped him. And somewhere in the silence after, he realized the night was no longer his. It belonged to her. The applause still lingered in the hall even after Clara had stepped back into her quiet role, the tray steady in her hands, her shoulders straight. It was not the usual applause of a party where champagne blurred judgment, and laughter came easy. This applause had weight, like a verdict handed down by a jury of peers. It filled every corner of the glittering penthouse and left Richard Haworth standing in the middle like a man stripped of his crown. He tried to gather himself, to summon the charm that had always carried him, but it no longer fit him. It clung like a borrowed coat on a cold night, stiff and obvious. He forced a laugh, brittle as shattering glass. "Enough, enough," he said, raising his hands as though to calm a crowd that no longer belonged to him. "We've all had our entertainment. Let's enjoy the rest of the evening." His voice reached for command, but it fell flat. The guests were no longer listening to him. Their eyes followed Clara, their murmurs swirled around her name, their admiration shifted toward the woman who had entered the night invisible and now stood undeniable. Clara, however, did not bask in it. She returned the tray to a side table and folded her hands neatly before her apron, standing with the same calm dignity she had carried at the beginning of the night. Yet her silence was not submission, it was composure, the kind of composure that rises only when one knows the truth is unshakable. The banker with the deep voice cleared his throat, addressing no one and everyone at once. "It seems the promise made tonight has yet to be fulfilled." The words were soft, but they carried, echoing like the toll of a bell. Heads nodded. A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. Richard felt the weight of every eye turned back toward him. For the first time in years, he felt cornered, not in a boardroom, not in a contract, but in his own home. He pulled at his cufflinks, straightened his jacket, and said with false ease, "Of course it will be fulfilled. You have my word." The irony of those words, after all that had happened, was not lost on anyone. Clara finally spoke, her voice clear but gentle. "You said your salary?" "Not a donation, not a token gesture. Your salary." She did not raise her chin in arrogance, she did not need to. Her calm was sharper than any blade. He wanted to argue, to twist her words into something harmless, but the banker's gaze, the older woman's pearls, the emerald-clad guest, and the many faces now hardened with expectation left him no escape. If he broke here, the ruin would not be private. It would spread, whispered into the ears of investors, carried in the gossip of his peers, staining him in places money could not reach. So he did the only thing left. He smiled, a smile that hurt, and pulled his phone from his pocket. "Very well," he said. "If a game becomes binding, let it be binding." His fingers tapped, each pressed like a hammer against his pride. He sent the instruction for transfer. He showed the confirmation to the nearest guests, their eyes scanning, their nods slow. The weight in the room shifted. The applause came again, but this time it was quieter, more controlled, as though the crowd itself understood the magnitude of what had happened. A maid had held a millionaire to his word. Richard lowered himself into a chair, suddenly looking older, smaller. The fight had drained from him, leaving only the shell of a man who had thought wealth made him untouchable. His hand trembled slightly around his glass, though he tried to hide it. The crystal chimed when it touched the marble table, betraying him. Clara remained still, not triumphant, not boastful. When she finally spoke, it was not to him but to the room. "Respect," she said, her voice carrying with ease, "is worth more than wealth. And tonight I am richer than any man here." The room erupted again, this time with genuine cheers. People raised their glasses, some even to her, a gesture no one would have imagined at the start of the evening. The quartet in the corner struck its strings once more, a melody rising like dawn after a long, cold night. Richard sat in silence, his empire intact but his reputation cracked beyond repair. He would recover money, perhaps, but he would never recover the power he had wielded so carelessly tonight. The whispers would follow him, each deal colored by the memory of this humiliation. He had given away more than a salary. He had surrendered the illusion that had sustained him. Clara stepped back, blending once more into the rhythm of service, but everyone knew she could never again be unseen. Her presence had shifted. She had revealed herself not as a servant, but as a woman of knowledge, dignity, and strength. Opportunities would come to her, offers of education, of partnership, of escape from the role he had tried to chain her to. She did not need to chase them. They would find her. The night wound down, the guests departing in clusters, their voices carrying the story already, shaping it into legend before the elevators reached the lobby. "Did you see her?" Fluent in half a dozen tongues. Held him accountable, in front of everyone. The story would grow wings, fly across the city, settle in places Richard could not touch. When the last of the laughter and footsteps faded, the penthouse seemed hollow, the chandelier's glow more harsh than golden. Richard sat alone, his glass empty, his phone buzzing with messages he could not bear to read. He stared out at the city, but for once, it did not seem to bow to him. It stretched wide and untamed, and somewhere out there, Clara's future shone brighter than his. She, meanwhile, walked home under the quiet sky, her shoes clicking softly against the pavement. The city lights painted her path, but she did not need them. She carried her own light now. And as she moved through the night, she remembered the look on his face when the room applauded her instead of him, and she knew something had shifted forever. Respect could not be bought, only earned. And tonight she had earned it, not just for herself, but for every silent voice that had ever been mocked, dismissed, or ignored. She whispered the words to herself, not in English but in her grandmother's language, carrying the weight of generations. Dignity is its own fortune. And in that truth, she walked taller than any millionaire,